At this point, it feels like forever ago. I believe it was at UFC 209 when it was officially announced that George St. Pierre was coming back and that his first fight back would be a title fight against Michael Bisping. At that point, when the fight was announced, there was no date that was announced with it. And it appears at this point, no date exists even still. I think a lot of people suspected that it'd be at International Fight Week. It would be on that UFC 213 card. But more fights are being added to that card, and the GSP versus Bisping fight is not one of the fights that have been added to the card. So at this point, there's a lot of concern as to whether or not this fight's going to happen in the near future, or if this fight's even going to be the next fight for the middleweight title. There has been some talk where Bisping said, hey, if GSP is not going to be ready in time, I can fight Yoel Romero, then have a 6-week turnaround, and then fight GSP. In theory, that sounds great, but if we're being realistic, Yoel Romero versus Michael Bisping likely is a win for Yoel Romero. At that point, he doesn't have to come back in 6 weeks, and even if Bisping did win the fight against Yoel Romero, you can't imagine that's going to be an easy fight for him to even be physically ready to get back into a training camp anytime soon doesn't seem likely, and for him to even get back into a fight within 6 weeks, it just seems incredibly unlikely. And beyond that, and this is something that I talked about before when I was talking about how this fight is probably one of the worst matchups I've ever seen in the UFC. I was first describing what makes sense about it and why each of the fighters would want to take it. And on Bisping's behalf, obviously, as the champion, he's getting pay-per-view points as a champion. Pay-per-view points are not guaranteed when you're not a champion. So for him, if you have the option of waiting 6 weeks in this case, and getting a fight against GSP, which is going to sell much more, and being guaranteed to get pay-per-view points on that card, versus taking a fight with Yoel Romero in the meantime, there's no reason why you would take the fight with Yoel Romero. And that's even if Yoel Romero was a guy who we did not expect to beat Bisping, a guy who shouldn't beat Bisping, it doesn't make sense for Bisping to even take the risk. When you consider the fact that Yoel Romero is as dangerous as he is, there really doesn't seem to be any reason why Bisping would want to take that fight. I feel like he's bluffing when he's saying that he's going to take that fight. And so what we're really going to have to wait on in the middleweight division is when GSP is finally ready, when Bisping is finally ready, when they finally get this fight put together. But it's frustrating to know that it doesn't seem like July is going to be the date for it. I don't know what other dates the UFC has planned in the future, whether they're going to be looking to push this into August, if they're going to push it all the way back to October. But you'd like to see this fight signed up very soon. The middleweight division, obviously with Yoel Romero and Anderson Silva, there was talk of those two fighting in the meantime. If you're looking at who's going to be the next contender, that could really throw a wrench into it. If Yoel and Anderson do fight, which I don't think they will, and Anderson wins, that could be incredibly problematic for them. Because again, you've got guys like Robert Whittaker. Jacare, unfortunately, isn't a guy you'd consider next in line now, but I think if Jacare looks good in his next fight, he's going to be right back in the title picture, but you still got him floating around there. You've got Luke Rockhold, Gegard Mousasi. I don't know whether or not they're going to be able to re-sign him, but he getting that very iffy victory over Chris Weidman, but still on paper, he got the victory. He's a guy who you figure should be in that picture. Yoel Romero, obviously. There's just so many guys who are waiting on this title shot, and the fact that the title fight hasn't been booked is really holding up the division, because if you can book that title fight right now, let's just say it's booked for August, then you can start saying, okay, well, we've got Robert Whittaker, we've got Yoel Romero, we maybe have Gegard Mousasi, we can still get Chris Weidman into the mix. I don't know if they're going to have Yoel Romero fight again, or if they're really going to say, okay, fine, well, we've got the fight booked for August. You can expect to fight for the title in December or early next year. Are you good with that? Yes. Okay, fine. We'll stash you away, and then we'll find the next contender in the meantime. But at least at that point, then you can start doing some matchups with the top guys in middleweight and start to clear that out. I think Luke Rockhold's involved there, too. I don't remember if I mentioned him. But you can really start clearing out that division and kind of making sense of who deserves to be at what point in the rank. But until that fight's booked, it's kind of hard to set your timing on all that, and it's really frustrating to see that these guys still haven't booked the time of that fight. This fight was bad enough when it was first announced, and that it made no sense, and it was already enough of a drain on the division. But the fact that they haven't booked it yet, it's just pushing the division back even more, and it's really unfortunate, because one of the things that I would always say when people would say, "Oh, the UFC, it's just about entertainment, it's just about selling tickets, it's not a sport," my question would always be, okay, that's interesting that you say that. Tell me which weight class you feel like the real champion is not holding the belt. And generally people would be like, okay, well, I mean, I guess the best guy is holding the belt at every weight class, and you would genuinely feel like that's the case. Middleweight, that hasn't been the case for a while. Yes, Michael Bisping did get that victory over Luke Rockhold, who was considered the top guy at the weight class. That obviously moved him to 1-1 with Rockhold. Rockhold obviously had finished him in the first fight. But hey, that's a legitimate win. You can't take that away from him. But then the next fight's against a retiring Dan Henderson, who's not even in the top 10. And now we're still waiting for him to fight against a guy coming out of retirement who hasn't fought in over 3 years, who hasn't even fought at the weight class. And it's just like, you feel like there's just a lot of, I don't know if you would say dishonesty, but there's just a lack of, really, it just doesn't feel genuine. It doesn't feel right to say that Michael Bisping is the middleweight champion. You feel like there are a lot of guys who are better than him, and Yoel Romero is included. And the fact that we might not see what I feel like is a legitimate title fight at middleweight between when he won the title, which I believe was back in July, all the way up until maybe early even next year, it's that shouldn't have happened. It can't happen, and I really hope it doesn't happen again in any other weight class. I hope that the UFC learns from this debacle and it doesn't happen again.